The clang of the heavy steel door behind me was like a physical blow, rattling my teeth and echoing through the long, sterile corridor. My name, Cole, felt like a distant whisper, already dissolving in the oppressive air of this place. The guard, a hulking man whose face was a mask of bored indifference, shoved me forward. "Move it, new fish," he grunted, the words scraped raw from years of disuse. I stumbled, my street clothes feeling flimsy and out of place against the rough, institutional walls. My first impression was a cocktail of senses, the metallic tang of old blood mixed with industrial cleaner, the stale sweat of too many bodies packed too close, and an undercurrent of something else, something vaguely acrid and unsettling. It was the smell of desperation, I decided, thick and cloying. The light, when we finally reached the intake holding area, was a sickly, flickering fluorescent glow from a single fixture above, casting long, dancing shadows that made the cramped space feel even more claustrophobic. This wasn't a cell, it was a cage. A massive, open-topped pen, its floor a patchwork of cracked concrete and stained linoleum. Around me, dozens of other men were already packed in, a volatile stew of anger, fear, and resignation. Some sat slumped against the grimy walls, eyes vacant. Others paced like caged animals, their boots scuffing the floor in a restless rhythm. A few groups huddled together, muttering in low, guttural tones, their eyes darting, assessing every new arrival. I felt their gazes rake over me, stripping away any last shred of dignity I might have clung to. My processing had been a blur of shouted commands and impersonal questions. They took my name, my history, my belongings, everything that made me me. Now I was just a number, a body to be catalogued and filed away. The guards at the processing desk, behind a thick pane of scratched glass, barked orders into a microphone, their voices distorted and tinny. Another guard, thinner and with a perpetually sneering mouth, stood near the entrance to the holding area, occasionally jabbing a baton against the metal bars, the sharp clink a constant reminder of our confinement. I found an empty spot near the far wall, away from the most agitated groups. The air was thick with unspoken threats. Every cough, every shuffle, every low growl carried a weight of potential violence. I watched an older inmate, his face a roadmap of scars and tattoos, glare at a younger, twitchier man who was mumbling to himself. The tension was palpable, a live wire humming just beneath the surface. I could almost taste it. A sudden, jarring shout erupted from the center of the room. "Who touched my damn sack?" The younger man, the twitcher, had apparently lost something. The older inmate, who hadn't moved a muscle, slowly turned his head. For a second, no one moved. The entire intake holding area seemed to hold its breath. Then the older inmate slowly pushed himself off the wall. My stomach clenched. This was it. This was how it started. Just as the older inmate took his first deliberate step, a low growl rumbled through the concrete beneath my feet. It wasn't human. It was deeper, more resonant, like the groan of an ancient machine or the distant thunder of a collapsing structure. The flickering fluorescent light above us shuddered violently, then died. The sudden, complete absence of light was more than just visual. It was a physical blow, a suffocating blanket that swallowed every sound, every form. The shouts from moments before were cut short, replaced by a collective gasp, then a cacophony of panicked cries. What the hell was that? Lights. I can't see a damn thing. The guards at the processing desk started yelling, their voices laced with an unfamiliar edge of panic. The thin guard near the entrance fumbled for something, his baton clattering uselessly against the bars. I heard the frantic scrambling of boots on concrete, the sickening thud of bodies colliding in the black. I pressed myself harder against the wall, trying to orient myself, to make sense of the chaos. The growling sound, that deep, unsettling rumble, was gone, but the feeling lingered, an echo in the marrow of my bones. It felt like the prison itself had taken a deep, shuddering breath. Then through the rising tide of shouts and curses I heard it, a different sound, a wet tearing noise like canvas ripping followed by a choked gurgle that ended abruptly. It was too close, too distinct, and far too horrifying to be just the usual prison scuffle. My breath hitched. This wasn't just a power outage. This was something else. The sudden, absolute blackness was like a physical blow. One moment, the harsh fluorescence hummed, casting sickly yellow light on the scarred concrete floor and the grim faces around me. The next, a suffocating void swallowed everything. The cacophony of the intake holding area during power outage didn't die instantly, it mutated. The guards' frantic yells, which had just moments ago been about maintaining order, now twisted into raw panic. I heard the sickening thud of bodies colliding, not just once, but a rapid succession of impacts, heavy and desperate. Then, the thin guard's baton, clattering uselessly against the bars, was just one more sharp sound in a symphony of sudden terror. My breath hitched. My eyes, useless now, strained against the overwhelming absence of light. The smell of sweat, fear, and stale urine intensified, thick and cloying. "Stay put, everyone stay put." A guard's voice, thick with desperation, tore through the sudden, churning chaos. But his command was instantly drowned out by a fresh wave of shouts, curses, and the frantic shuffling of dozens of feet. There was a sickening scrape, like metal being dragged across the floor, followed by a sharp yelp that was cut brutally short. What was that? It didn't sound like a fight between inmates. It sounded different, more clinical, more efficient. I pressed my back against the grimy wall, trying to orient myself. The sheer number of bodies packed into this space had been overwhelming even with the lights on, a volatile stew of anger and despair. Now without sight, the proximity of so many unknown, agitated men was terrifying. Every brush of fabric, every muffled cough, every shifting footstep felt like a direct threat. My determination, which had been a fragile shield against the brutality of this place, felt like it was cracking under the immense pressure of the unknown. I had to focus to find some anchor. From somewhere near the far wall, a low, guttural growl rippled through the air. It wasn't human. Not exactly. It had a wet, throaty quality that sent a shiver down my spine. Disembodied, indistinct, they seemed to drift from everywhere and nowhere, a ghostly chorus of barely perceptible sibilant sounds. They slithered through the panicked shouts and the heavy breathing, tickling the edge of my hearing. Were they real? Then came the scratching. It started low, a soft, rhythmic scrape, like fingernails dragging across stone, but too deep, too resonant to be human. It seemed to emanate from the ceiling, directly above where I stood, then moved slowly, deliberately across the expanse of the intake holding area during power outage. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It wasn't the frantic scratching of a trapped animal. The sound wasn't just on the ceiling anymore. It seemed to be coming from the walls now too, like something was moving within the very structure of the building. A guard's voice, tight with fear, suddenly pierced through the din, amplified by the static crackle of a handheld radio. "Copy, we have a situation. I repeat, a situation in intake. Something's. It's not right, I can hear it. It's not one of them." His voice was hoarse, strained, bordering on a sob. There was a desperate urgency in his tone that went beyond dealing with a riot. He wasn't talking about inmates. A sudden, sharp clang echoed from somewhere deeper inside the room, followed by a choked gasp. The guard on the radio cried out, a raw, terrified sound, then his voice dissolved into a strangled gurgle. The scratching resumed, no longer just on the walls, but now seemingly coming from the floor too, directly beneath my feet. It felt like the very foundation of this brutal place was being gnawed away, piece by terrifying piece. The cacophony of the intake holding area during power outage. My ears, suddenly deprived of visual input, were overwhelmed. The shouts of the guards, previously a constant, grating backdrop, now took on a frantic edge. "Stay put, everyone stay put," one of the officers bellowed, his voice cracking with an unfamiliar strain. Another guard's voice, closer, barked into a radio, but it was just static, a harsh hiss that only intensified the feeling of isolation. Inmates, who moments ago had been shuffling, whispering, or outright yelling obscenities, now erupted in a chorus of confused roars and nervous laughter. A few began banging on the metal grates of their individual holding cells, a rhythmic clang that vibrated through the very floor beneath my worn boots. The air, already thick with the smell of stale sweat, unwashed bodies, and something metallic I couldn't quite place, now felt heavier, almost viscous. My breath caught in my throat. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to move, to run, but where? There was nowhere to go. This intake holding area during power outage was a cage, and now it was a blind one. It wasn't a human growl. It was too deep, too resonant, like something tearing through thick flesh. The clamor of the other inmates faltered, a ripple of uneasy quiet spreading outwards from the sound's origin. Even the guards, their voices strained with authority a moment ago, fell silent. Then it came. It was a scream. The clang of metal, the nervous laughter. The guards' shouts all gone. The intake holding area during power outage was absolutely, terrifyingly still. My own heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden vacuum of sound. I held my breath, straining my ears, my eyes wide and useless in the black. I could hear my own blood rushing, a frantic pulse in my temples. The metallic smell in the air seemed to intensify, sharp and coppery. There was that blood, just then, with a tortured groan. A few emergency lights flickered to life, bathing the vast intake holding area in a sickly, intermittent orange glow. They pulsed weakly, like dying embers, offering only fleeting glimpses of the horror that had just unfolded. In that first, shuddering flash, my eyes darted to the corner where the scream had come from. The boisterous inmate, the one who had been taunting everyone, the one who had been so full of himself, he was gone. Where his bulky frame had been, there was now only an empty space. The light pulsed again, stronger this time, and I could see it clearly, a fresh, viscous pool spread in an irregular pattern, catching the weak orange light like spilled oil. It was unmistakably blood, and it wasn't just a few drops. It was a substantial amount, far more than a simple nosebleed or a cut could produce. A fresh, sickening odor of iron and something else, something cloyingly sweet and organic, reached me even from a distance. The empty space, the blood, a collective gasp rippled through the remaining inmates, a sound of sudden horror. No one spoke. No one dared to. We had all heard the scream. We had all seen the aftermath. The boisterous inmate hadn't just been moved. He hadn't just been taken by the guards. He was gone, vanished, leaving behind only the undeniable evidence of violence. Whatever had made that sound, whatever had caused that scream, wasn't human. It wasn't another inmate. Wasn't a guard. We weren't just trapped in a blackout. The game had changed. This wasn't just about surviving the system anymore. This was about surviving it. The officer's voice, raw with panic, was swallowed by the sudden, absolute blackness that had consumed the intake holding area during power outage. My ears, previously overwhelmed by the cacophony, now strained to pick out individual sounds from the oppressive void. Another guard's voice, closer, barked orders, but the words were lost in a rising tide of shouts from the other prisoners. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a drumbeat in the suffocating dark. The air, already thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and stale disinfectant, now felt heavy, charged with fear. I could hear the shuffle of feet, the scrape of rough fabric, and the ragged breaths of dozens of men crammed into this confined space. A low growl rumbled from somewhere to my left, followed by a sharp retort. "Watch it, old man," a younger prisoner snarled. The initial shock of the blackout had given way to a volatile cocktail of confusion and rage. Without the glare of the fluorescent lights, the thin veneer of order imposed by the guards had crumbled. I heard a scuffle, a grunt, and then the sickening thud of body hitting the floor. No screams, just the sound of heavy breathing and the continued shuffling. Someone had just been knocked down, or worse. The guards, I realized, were spread too thin, their flashlights either dead or not yet deployed. Their frantic shouts to maintain control sounded increasingly desperate, like men trying to hold back a rising tide with their bare hands. "Keep your hands to yourselves," a guard yelled, his voice echoing oddly in the vast, unseen space, but it was useless. I heard a series of quick, sharp slaps, then a yelp. "He took my rations," a voice accused, high-pitched with fury. "Liar," another retorted. The sounds of a full-blown brawl erupted a few feet away, a tangle of grunts and thuds and curses. It was exactly what I'd feared, the prisoners turning on each other, their paranoia and fear boiling over. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to breathe slowly, trying to filter the chaos. My eyes were useless here. I had to rely on my ears, my nose, the subtle shifts in the air. That's when I heard it, a sound distinct from the human commotion. A soft, wet slurp, almost like something drawing a long, slow breath through a narrow opening. It was close, too close. It wasn't coming from the brawling prisoners, nor did it sound like any of the guards. It was different, and it seemed to be moving. It was cut short abruptly, as if a hand had clamped over a mouth. The brawl continued for a moment, then faltered, the combatants suddenly still, listening. One moment the prisoner was there, yelling, fighting. The next he was gone. No struggle. No dragging sound, just an absence. This wasn't just agitated inmates. A faint, almost imperceptible shift in the air currents around me. Was it just my imagination, or had the temperature dropped a fraction of a degree? I strained my ears, trying to locate the source of that unsettling slurp. The guards were still yelling, but their commands were now laced with a new uncertainty, a sudden realization that something was deeply wrong. Their flashlights finally began to flicker on, weak beams cutting through the gloom, dancing wildly as the officers swept them across the faces of the terrified prisoners. I saw the face of a prisoner near me, illuminated briefly by a passing beam. He wasn't looking at the guards or the other prisoners. Then I felt it. A whisper of cold air like a breath brushed against my ear. It carried a faint, metallic tang like old blood and something else, something ancient and earthy. Like disturbed soil, my entire body locked up. I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. A new wave of panic erupted among the prisoners. A prisoner stumbled backward, tripped over someone, and fell with a cry. Before he could even push himself up, there was another of those sickening slurps, louder this time, followed by a wet, tearing sound. The flashlight beams, now more numerous, swept over the spot, but there was nothing there. Just an empty patch of concrete where a man had been. This wasn't a riot. This was a hunt, and we were the prey. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. My determination, previously focused on simply surviving the prison system, now sharpened into a desperate resolve. I had to understand what this thing was, how it moved, how it hunted. Otherwise, I was just another meal waiting to be served in the suffocating blackness of the intake holding area during power outage. The shouts of the guards, previously a constant, if distant anchor, had fragmented into desperate, choked-off cries. The air, already thick with the smell of stale sweat and disinfectant, now held a new metallic tang, subtle but insistent, like old blood mixed with something acrid. I pressed my back against the cold, rough concrete wall of my temporary cell, my breath catching in my throat. I could hear other inmates, close by, breathing in ragged gasps, their fear a palpable presence that mirrored my own. A low, guttural moan rumbled somewhere to my left, quickly cut short. Anyone still breathing out there? A voice rasped from the cell beside mine, low and gravelly, cutting through the heavy quiet. It was an older inmate. I remembered his leathery face from before the lights died, scarred and world-weary. "Kid, you still with us?" My throat felt dry, but I managed a choked. "Yeah, good, smart move sticking to the wall. This ain't just a power cut, boy. Something else is moving in this damn intake holding area during power outage." His voice was devoid of panic, replaced by a grim resignation that was almost more terrifying than outright fear. "You hear that dragging sound earlier, before the screamers went quiet?" I hadn't, not specifically. My mind had been too busy cataloging the general chaos, the question feeling foolish even as I asked it. "We don't wait to find out what's coming for us," the inmate replied. His voice closer now, as if he'd moved to the front of his cell. "They ain't got the doors locked down tight enough in here. Temporary cells, a good kick might do it." There was a grunt, then the distinct metallic shriek of stressed steel. "You got any weight to you, kid? Give your door a shove. Maybe we can get out of this particular corner of the intake holding area during power outage." The desperation in his plan was evident, but so was the logic. Staying put was a death sentence. I took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to summon some semblance of strength. I braced myself, then threw my shoulder into it, grunting with effort. The door rattled but held. Again, the inmate urged, his own cell door groaning. Together, I hit it again, then again, each impact sending a jolt up my arm. On the fourth try, with a protesting screech of metal, the latch gave way. A faint, cloying scent like ozone and something rotten wafted in. "That's it, kid," the inmate exclaimed, his voice laced with a sliver of triumph. Moments later, his own door scraped open, and I heard a heavy thud as he stepped out. "All right, Cole, we stick together. No heroics, no wandering off." I pushed my door fully open and stepped out, arms extended, immediately bumping into the inmate. He was a solid mass of muscle and bone, radiating a strange sense of calm despite the circumstances. "Follow my hand," he commanded, his large, calloused hand finding my shoulder. "Stay close. We need to find an exit, or at least a light source. It's not natural." We shuffled forward, our feet scraping against the grimy concrete floor. It was too deep, too organic to be structural. It felt like a heartbeat, but one that echoed from the bowels of the earth. We moved past what I assumed were more empty cells, their open doors gaping like silent mouths. Then, my foot snagged on something. It felt like fabric, rough and heavy, but soaked through. My fingers explored further, encountering something stiff, almost brittle, then a strange, gelatinous consistency. A wave of nausea washed over me. I pulled my hand back sharply, the rotten smell suddenly overwhelming. "Don't tell me," the inmate muttered, his voice grim. "It's what I think it is, ain't it?" I couldn't speak, just shook my head violently. My mind was painting pictures I didn't want to see, of whatever had been wearing that uniform, of whatever had left it behind in such a gruesome state. The metallic tang in the air now felt like a taste in my mouth. The sound was so close, so visceral, that I froze, my breath catching. Whatever had been here, whatever had been feasting, was still here. It was moving. "That's our cue," the inmate growled, his voice low and urgent. He pulled me forward, no longer guiding, but practically dragging me. "We need to move, now, before it decides we're next on the menu." The fear was no longer a distant hum, it was a roaring inferno in my chest. We stumbled blindly, our only guide the desperate need to escape the suffocating horror that now filled every inch of the intake holding area during power outage. I could hear other, fainter sounds now, whimpers, distant sobs, the occasional sharp crack that sounded sickeningly like bone. And we were trapped inside it. The fear was no longer a distant hum, it was a roaring inferno in my chest, a firestorm fueled by the suffocating horror that now filled every inch of the intake holding area during power outage. The air itself pressed down, heavy and thick, as if the very darkness had gained mass, solidifying around us. My breath hitched, ragged and shallow, each inhale a struggle against the unseen presence that clung to us like a shroud. I could feel it, a cold, hungry awareness brushing against my skin, a silent predator stalking in the black. "This way, Cole," the older inmate rasped, his voice a strained whisper barely cutting through the oppressive silence. His hand, surprisingly firm, gripped my arm, pulling me forward. We'd been stumbling for what felt like hours, blindly navigating the treacherous terrain of overturned benches and scattered personal effects, our only compass the desperate need to escape. The screams had faded, replaced by an unnerving quiet broken only by the scuff of our shoes and the frantic thrum of my own pulse. A sudden, sharp crack echoed nearby, making me flinch and suck in a breath. It sounded like something had given way, a structural groan from the ancient building itself. The older inmate froze, his grip tightening to a painful degree or deeper in. He didn't sound hopeful, driven by a sliver of desperate curiosity, or perhaps just the instinct to move. We shuffled towards the sound. Suddenly my fingers met open air, not a doorway but a jagged tear in the wall. I pushed my hand deeper into the gap. The concrete was rough, crumbling at the edges. It felt like a section of the wall had collapsed inward, creating an impromptu passage into a space that shouldn't exist. "It's a hole," I reported, the absurdity of the statement not lost on me. "It goes somewhere. Somewhere worse, probably," he grumbled. We squeezed through the narrow opening, the rough concrete scraping against my jumpsuit. The space beyond was tighter, a short, low tunnel that forced us to crouch, our backs hunched. The air here was heavy, stagnant, carrying the distinct scent of decay and something else, something acrid like old iron and fear. We emerged into a small, circular chamber. The floor was uneven, littered with debris. This wasn't a standard cell. This felt older, much older. The walls were rough-hewn, not the smooth, reinforced concrete of the intake holding area during power outage I'd grown accustomed to. My fingers traced deep grooves, then shallower scratches. "Look," the older inmate breathed, his voice hushed with awe and horror. He had found something on the wall. What little light permeated from the distant emergency glow was almost useless, but as my eyes adjusted, I could make out shapes. Crude, desperate etchings covered the stone surface. They weren't typical prison graffiti. No gang tags, no defiant declarations. These were symbols, primitive and disturbing. Below it, scratched with desperate fury, were words, not English, not anything I recognized. I know a bit from back in the seminary, Umbram fames. This wasn't some deranged inmate's fantasy. This was a warning. As my gaze swept across the walls, I noticed something else tucked into a shallow niche. It was a small, leather-bound book, its cover brittle and cracked. I pulled it free, dust puffing out around it. The pages felt thick, almost like parchment. "A journal," I mumbled, my fingers trembling as I ran them over the ancient binding. "Careful, Cole," the older inmate warned, his voice tight. "Who knows what's in there?" I ignored him, my determination overriding my fear. If there was an answer, a way to fight this thing, it had to be here. I fumbled for my makeshift lighter, a relic from my days outside, and flicked it open. With a tiny flicker of light, I could finally see the journal's contents. The script was faded, handwritten, and erratic. The entries grew frantic, the handwriting sloping wildly, not voices but a feeling, a hunger. It feeds on the fear. The isolation is its greatest weapon. They say this place was built on an old burial ground, a place of sacrifice. They built the prison over it to contain something, not just us. To bury it deeper, but it stirs. It stirs when the light dies. My eyes darted to the older inmate. His face was a mask of grim understanding. Contains something, he echoed, his voice barely a breath, not just us. I turned another page, the brittle paper threatening to tear. The guards, they know something or knew, they tried to keep it quiet. The disappearances, not escapees, never escapees, they just vanish, they become part of the hunger. The thing is ancient. Older than this stone, it waits, it feeds, and when the power fails, its grip strengthens. It explained everything. The disappearances, the crushing weight in the air, the feeling of being watched. This wasn't just a prison riot or a simple blackout. This was a prison built atop a tomb, a cage for something far more terrible than any man. The intake holding area during power outage was not just a temporary holding pen, it was a feeding ground. And we were trapped within its walls, offerings to an entity that had waited centuries for the lights to go out. The true nature of our predicament, the sheer, ancient horror of it all, settled over me like a suffocating blanket, heavier and more terrifying than any physical blow. We hadn't stumbled into a way out. We'd stumbled into the heart of its history, and perhaps its larder. The intake holding area, I realized with a sickening jolt, was more than just a temporary cage. It was the heart of it all. A profound chill settled deep in my bones. My breath hitched, a ragged sound swallowed by the suffocating silence that had replaced the earlier chaos. I tried to recall anything, any detail I might have missed during the brief moments of light, any oddity in the architecture of this grim chamber. The air itself felt thick, not just with the stench of fear and unwashed bodies, but with something ancient, a dust that had settled for millennia before being stirred awake. I moved slowly, my hands scraping along the rough concrete wall, the grit biting into my fingertips. My eyes strained, useless. Then my fingers brushed against something different, not just a crack, but a deliberate indentation. I ran my hand over it, feeling a series of grooves, irregular but distinct. They weren't the crude etchings of a bored inmate. These felt older, deeper. I leaned closer, pressing my face against the cold stone, trying to decipher the shapes by touch alone. They were symbols, I was sure of it, carved into the very foundation of this place. Jagged lines, swirling patterns, crude depictions of something clawed and misshapen. A faint, almost imperceptible hum resonated through the stone, a vibration that resonated not in my ears, but in my teeth, in the very marrow of my bones. The hum intensified, a low thrumming that seemed to emanate from the ground beneath my feet, from the walls around me, from the very air I breathed. It was the sound of something awakening, stretching. I understood then. This prison wasn't just built atop a tomb, it was the tomb. These walls, this concrete, it was all part of an elaborate, horrifying seal. It had shattered the ritual, the arcane circuit that had kept this thing dormant. It was the entity reaching out, tasting the fear that now permeated the intake holding area. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to push back, but it was like trying to stop a tsunami with my bare hands. It fed on fear, on isolation, on the despair of trapped souls. This entire facility, teeming with its volatile mix of inmates, was a banquet. It was too close. The entity was moving, bolder now, freed from its ancient chains. I stumbled backward, tripping over something unseen, landing hard on my backside. The symbols on the wall pulsed with a faint, unholy warmth against my hands where I'd instinctively braced myself. As I scrambled to my feet, my foot knocked against something metallic. It was a guard's forgotten flashlight, miraculously intact, though its beam was useless in the complete power failure. But its mere presence, a symbol of a world that still had light, gave me a sliver of desperate hope. Then, a presence solidified beside me. Wasn't something I saw, but something I felt. A profound emptiness, a vacuum that sucked the warmth from the air, the sound from my ears, the very breath from my lungs, hunger mine. A sharp, searing pain exploded behind my eyes as if invisible claws were raking across my brain. I cried out, a strangled sound that barely escaped my throat. My body convulsed, my muscles locking up, trembling uncontrollably. I saw their faces, their dying moments, their desperate pleas, all funneled into this one insatiable entity. It was trying to consume me, not just my body, but my very essence, my will. I fought back, a desperate, animalistic struggle. I bit down hard on my tongue, the metallic tang of my own blood a jarring shock that helped ground me. I focused on the pain, on the taste, on the cold metal of the flashlight still clutched in my hand. It was an anchor, with a final, desperate surge of adrenaline. I shoved back against the unseen force. The pressure on my chest lessened, but the psychic assault continued, leaving a searing ache behind my eyes. I gasped for air, my lungs burning, my throat raw. When the immediate agony receded, I collapsed against the wall, trembling uncontrollably. My head throbbed, a dull, constant ache that felt like a permanent scar. I knew without a shadow of a doubt that I had brushed against the entity's core. I had felt its true nature, its ancient, consuming hunger. I had been touched, violated, but I had survived. And now I knew the power outage wasn't just an accident, it was an invitation. And this thing, this ancient horror, was finally awake and ravenous in the intake holding area. The cold pressure on my chest intensified, a crushing weight that stole the air from my lungs. My vision swam with static, the searing pain behind my eyes, a white-hot spear driven through my skull. My muscles locked, trembling. My body a marionette strung taut by an unseen puppeteer. I felt myself being pushed down, not just by the weight, but by a chilling, invisible force, attempting to pin me to the grimy concrete floor of the intake holding area during the power outage. It wasn't just physical, it was a violation, an invasion that gnawed at the edges of my sanity, promising oblivion. A primal scream tore through me, not from my throat, but from a deeper, more ancient part of my being that refused to yield. I thrashed, a desperate, uncontrolled spasm. The pain in my head spiked, but so did a flicker of defiant rage. This thing wanted me still, wanted me silent, wanted me afraid. It wanted me to surrender. I wouldn't. With a guttural roar that felt like it ripped my throat open, I twisted, wrenching my body against the invisible pressure. The metallic grating, surprisingly heavy and sharp-edged, was still clutched in my hand. I brought it up, not knowing what I was striking, only knowing I had to fight. I gasped, sucking in ragged gulps of the stale, heavy air. My head throbbed, but the searing pain had receded, replaced by a dull, insistent ache. I scrambled backward, crab-walking across the slick concrete, the heavy grate still clutched in my trembling hand. The air around me felt charged, heavy, vibrating with an unseen presence. It was here, still here, lurking in the blackness, enraged. My mind, though battered, clicked into a grim clarity. It craved the stillness of its prey, the silent surrender. But what if there was no stillness? What if I denied it the very conditions it needed to thrive? A desperate, suicidal plan began to form, a chaotic, reckless gamble. If it hunted in the quiet, then I would make a deafening noise. If it thrived in isolation, I would force it into a confrontation that shattered its preferred hunting ground. I remembered the heavy, rusted emergency door at the far end of the intake area, a door rarely used, leading to an abandoned service tunnel. It was a massive slab of pitted steel, secured by an equally massive, rusted bolt. It would make a hell of a racket if I could get it open, or even just bang on it. But first, I needed a distraction, something to draw its attention, to make it believe I was still its cowering prey. I could hear its subtle movements now, a faint, wet scraping sound that seemed to slither across the concrete, circling me. The stench of damp earth and something acrid, metallic, grew stronger. It was closing in. I gripped the metal grate tighter, its rough edges biting into my palm. I took a shaky breath, then hurled the grate with all my remaining strength towards the opposite wall, aiming for the clang of a metal pipe I'd vaguely remembered seeing there. Immediately, the wet scraping sound surged towards the impact point. I heard a muffled thud, a guttural snarl that seemed to vibrate in my bones. It had taken the bait, now was my chance. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs wobbly, my head spinning. I moved not towards the door, but towards the row of empty holding cells. I needed something more, something to truly disrupt it. I remembered the old, unused fire extinguisher mounted on the wall near the cell block entrance. It was probably empty or jammed, but it was heavy, and it was metal, and it was loud. The scraping sound was receding from the grate, now moving with disturbing speed towards the cells. It had realized its mistake. It was coming for me. My fingers found the nozzle, the heavy metal body. I wrenched it from its bracket, the old screws protesting with a piercing shriek of metal. The sound seemed to make the very air shiver. The scraping stopped. My arms screamed in protest, but I ignored it. Well, I ran not getting it from me. Then I swung, not at the unseen horror, not yet. I swung at the nearest cell door, a rusted heavy steel slab. The extinguisher connected with a deafening metallic crash, that reverberated through the entire intake holding area during the power outage. A shriek, not human, not animal, but something ancient and utterly alien, tore through the air. It was a sound of pure agony, of something violated and exposed. I stumbled, nearly falling, but I held my ground. I swung again and again, hammering the extinguisher against the steel door. Crash, clang, bang. The cacophony was deafening, overwhelming, a brutal assault on the senses. The air itself seemed to crackle with its pain, its rage. I wasn't just hitting a door, I was hitting it. I was assaulting its very nature. The knowledge hit me like a physical blow. It couldn't stand the disruption, the sheer, unbridled chaos of sound. A desperate, wet scrabbling sound echoed from the far end of the intake area, fading rapidly. It was retreating. My arms were numb, my chest heaving, but I kept going, hammering the door until my muscles gave out and the extinguisher slipped from my grasp, clattering to the floor. The acrid smell was gone, replaced by the lingering scent of rust and concrete. I dropped to my knees, gasping, shaking uncontrollably. My plan hadn't destroyed it, I knew that, but I had driven it back. I had bought myself a precious, fragile moment, and I had learned its secret. The entity was wounded, or at least disoriented. This was my chance, not to escape the prison, but to escape it. And I knew exactly where it had retreated, and I had to follow. The fire extinguisher connected with the rusted steel door, a deafening crash that tore through the absolute darkness of the intake holding area during power outage. The sound was a physical blow, a shockwave that rattled my teeth and vibrated up my arms. For a split second, the oppressive weight of the unseen presence seemed to recoil, a flicker of hesitation in the suffocating black. I didn't wait. I swung again, a desperate, clumsy arc that connected with nothing but air, the heavy metal canister whistling past where I imagined the thing's head might have been. A guttural, wet snarl answered me, closer this time, and I felt a gust of frigid, foul-smelling air against my face. It was a smell like stagnant water mixed with something ancient and metallic, a scent that prickled the hairs on my neck and made my stomach churn. It wasn't retreating, it was just annoyed. Then, from somewhere far off, a distant, almost imperceptible thrum asterisk began. It was a low hum growing steadily louder, a vibration that started in the concrete floor beneath my feet and traveled up my legs. The generators, they were kicking in. A faint, sickly orange glow flickered at the far end of the intake holding area, dancing across the grimy walls. It was weak, hesitant, but it was there. The entity, whatever it was, let out another frustrated, hissing sound, a sound that seemed to scrape against my eardrums. Then, with a sudden jarring surge, the fluorescent lights above us sputtered to life, bathing the entire intake holding area in a harsh, unforgiving white. I blinked, my eyes burning, struggling to adjust. Dust motes danced in the stark light, suspended in the air like tiny, glittering specters. I stood there, panting, the heavy fire extinguisher still clutched in my trembling hands, my grip tight. The intake holding area was a wreck. Several cell doors hung askew, their heavy bolts twisted and bent as if ripped open by an impassable force. One door lay entirely on the floor, its hinges sheared clean through. The air, though now clearer, still carried that faint, metallic stench, clinging to the walls like a memory. The ones that had been full of shouting, terrified men just moments before now stood silent, gaping more like holes in the wall. The bunk beds inside were ripped, mattresses torn, but there was no sign of the inmates who had occupied them. No bodies, no struggle marks on the floor, just gone like they'd simply evaporated. Then the shouts started. Not mine, not the entities. These were human voices, bellowing commands, their words echoing with a frantic urgency. Heavy boots pounded down the main corridor. A squad of guards, their faces grim and wary, burst into the intake holding area, their batons drawn, their flashlights cutting through the residual gloom. On the ground, everyone on the ground. A guard's voice roared, amplified by the enclosed space. I stood frozen, still clutching the extinguisher, my mind reeling. The light was back, the immediate threat gone. But the horror had etched itself onto my very soul. It was too much. A guard, a burly man with a scowl etched into his face, spotted me first. "You drop it, drop the weapon now," he barked, his flashlight beam pinning me like a moth. My fingers were numb, stiff around the extinguisher handle. It took a conscious effort to loosen my grip. The heavy canister clattered to the floor with a dull thud. I raised my hands slowly, instinctively, my eyes darting from the guards to the ruined cells. "What the hell happened here, Cole?" Another guard demanded, his voice laced with suspicion. He gestured vaguely at the chaos. "Where's the others?" I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, raw. It took them. The guards exchanged glances. Disbelief, tinged with a flicker of something unreadable, crossed their faces. They saw the overturned cells, the damage, the missing inmates. They saw me, wild-eyed and shaking, covered in dust and grime. But they didn't see the thing. I trained to pull one over on us, Cole. They didn't believe me. How could they? The evidence was all wrong, all circumstantial. The shattered cells, the vanished prisoners, it all pointed to a mass escape, or perhaps a brutal internal conflict. My story of a predatory horror awakened by the blackout would sound like the ravings of a man pushed to the brink. They cuffed me, roughly, pulling my arms behind my back. As they led me away, past the gaping cell doors and the lingering metallic stench, I kept glancing back. The intake holding area, now bathed in the harsh, unforgiving light, seemed to breathe. They booked me, interrogated me. My story was met with blank stares, then with thinly veiled contempt. I ran in shock, Cole, a correctional officer stated flatly, jotting notes on a pad. Mass hysteria. It happens in these situations. They dismissed it as prison riot chaos. Another incident in a long line of incidents. They didn't see the truth, but I knew what I had faced. They could lock me in a cell, they could dismiss my words, but they couldn't erase what I had experienced. The horror wasn't gone. It had merely retreated, waiting for the next blackout, the next moment of vulnerability. The intake holding area, that brutal, chaotic chamber, had been a cage, and I had been thrown into it. I know it's still there, lurking in the deep, forgotten corners of this place, waiting for its next opportunity. They just wait for the lights to go out.